I hope that you enjoyed watching that story. I would like to take a little bit of time and unpack some of what I see going on in the story. And maybe there were times where you're like, why is he doing it that way? And so hopefully this will reinforce the impact of the story that you have heard through some description of what was going on. For me, I'll cut to the chase. This story is about three healings. It's about the healing of Jairus' daughter, indeed the rising. It's about the healing of the woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. And it's about the healing of the social fabric that has set up the world in such a way that the unclean woman and the synagogue leader's house will generally not cross paths. Right? So there's two individual healings and a social healing that happens when the reign of God shows up in this story. So there's suggestions throughout the passage that there's connections between the woman's story and Jairus' family story. The first is that Jairus falls down before Jesus, and a little bit later the woman does exactly the same gesture. So we have a man of honor and prestige, a leader of the synagogue, a leader of this gathering place where the community comes together for deliberation. And then the other key character is a woman who probably wouldn't be allowed into the community of deliberation because her continual bleeding for 12 years renders her unclean. Right? So to me, there's a tension between the insider and the outsider in the story. But even the insider is in a desperate situation, and thus he comes seeking out Jesus, hoping for help from him. So I want to say that the bleeding woman and Jairus are held together in what one author says is the solidarity of the shaken, right? They're bound together by the brokenness of their lives. There are other cues that these two stories are related to each other. The woman has suffered from a flow of blood for 12 years. The little girl is 12 years old, we're told at the end of the story. And of course, when you're 12 years old and a girl, it's about the time that bleeding starts to happen. And so I think there's a connection between those two. And the other connecting point is Jesus. And so in my interpretation of the story, Jairus is on this desperate mission, and he's sprinting, trying to get with Jesus to the place where his daughter can get healing. But in the middle of it, there's an interruption that causes tension. And indeed, the way the woman is described, and it's extensive, helps to create this feeling of tension. And so the narrator begins to describe her, and in my opinion, begins to become like her. So the woman, there's a series of participles. So there's not a main verb, even though your English translation that you have in your Bible might have one. In the Greek, it doesn't have it. There's a series of participles that describe the woman. Now there was a woman having had a flow of blood for 12 years, having suffered many things under the hands of many physicians. Indeed, having spent everything she had, she was no better off, but was getting worse. Hearing about Jesus, coming behind him in the crowd, she touched his cloak, right? And so there's this sense of desperation, and it's just ongoing. Come on, give the woman some rest. And when she touches, experience that relief. Jesus seeks her out. The disciples, this humorous moment, right? You see everybody pressing you and you ask who touched you, but Jesus keeps looking to see who had done it. And the woman falls before him in that same posture that Jairus had and tells him the whole truth. And Jesus lifts her up and calls her daughter. So over and against Jairus' daughter, this woman is restored to the family of God as Jesus calls her daughter, and he commends her for what she's done. I try to emphasize the commendation of Jesus by having him lift her up from the ground and look her in the eyes. And he says to her, your courageous trust has saved you. So the translation you're probably most familiar with is faith, but sometimes we think faith is something that happens up here. In Mark's gospel, it's about trust. And it's not just trust that sits and rests, it's trust that seeks out what it longs for. And so this woman pushes herself, wedges herself into a place she's not supposed to be in her unclean state, and she touches Jesus. When she touches Jesus, he too becomes unclean through contact with someone who's unclean. Thus, when I hear those who in the midst of this interruption come and tell Jairus the bad news that his daughter has died, right? They look at Jesus holding on to this unclean woman and with scorn. They say, this teacher. But Jesus takes them with him, right? They get to the house. There's the commotion, weeping and wailing. He goes in. They taunt him once again. He sends them out. He drives them out. It's a strong word in Greek. It's what Jesus does with demons. He drives them out of the house. And he goes and he takes the hand of the little girl, having taken the father and mother with him in this tender moment, kind of shakes her and says, Talitha kum, which means, little girl, I say to you, rise. She got up and started walking around, right? It's this lovely moment of Jairus having stuck with Jesus even after he becomes unclean. Jairus paying attention to the courageous trust of the woman and embodying it himself, finds that healing can come not only to his daughter, but to his house, to the whole society that he lives in. And I love this moment. I was filming outside. I didn't have a moment when I'm doing a performance of the whole Gospel of Mark, which is something I do sometimes. And they were stunned with great astonishment. I let you think the story's done. Oh! And Jesus told them not to tell anyone about this. Ha! Like that's possible. And to give the girl something to eat. Right? And so you get this sense at the end of the story. How could you not, Jesus? Don't you think those who were at the funeral are going to bring it up? And so you have this final impact of the story that says, even if Jesus himself told you to keep your mouth shut about the good news, how could you possibly? I really appreciate you giving me this time, thinking about this wonderful story with you. And I pray that you might find healing in your life, healing with those whom you've never noticed before, and that in some way through Jesus, our whole community might find healing. Thank you.